welcome to the 4th grade model lesson station for the 4th 6 weeks. My name is Yolanda Williams and I'm the AS at Johnston Elementary. We're so glad you've opted to join us today. For this model lesson, we are focusing on a reading strategy for narrative nonfiction. These slides are all from slidescarnival.com, just in case you're wondering. All right, we're starting with the strategy, Why Does the Story Matter? And that's taken from the Reading Strategies book by Jennifer Saravallo. And our opening is, in narrative nonfiction, true information told in the form of stories, the main idea may be a question of what's most important about the story as a whole. After reading a true story, we can ask ourselves clarifying questions to monitor and adjust our comprehension. The skills that we'll be focusing on are determining importance and synthesizing. And again, we're looking at the genre or text type, narrative nonfiction. All right, so let's take a look at our TEAK. Hold please. All right, the first part of this TEAK, TEAK 4.7, students understand, make inferences, and draw conclusions about varied structural patterns and features of literary nonfiction and provide evidence from the text to support their understanding. But it doesn't stop there. Okay? Students are expected to identify similarities and differences between the events and characters' experiences in a fictional work and the actual events and experience described in the author's biography or autobiography. That is a mouthful, but if you notice, the highlighted portion is where we are going to focus because we want to take those larger TEAKs and break them down into smaller chunks. Our mini lessons should always be focused and very narrow so that we can make sure we're not overwhelming our kiddos and we're giving them exactly what they need. So our focus will be, students are expected to identify similarities and differences between the events and characters' experiences in a fictional work and the actual events and experiences described in an author's biography or autobiography. So basically, we're going to be taking a look at how to read those two genres with a focus on the narrative nonfiction. All right, before we dive into the actual lesson, let's take a look at the overall components. We're going to start with the strategy anchor chart. Okay. As readers of biography, and remember, you can write in autobiography, you can change that one. We're going to focus on biography for this model lesson. We're going to preview the text. We think, what do I already know about this person? Think, what details should I focus on? And what relates to the big victory or big struggle that the person has? We read closely, follow or track the theory in steps, and use traits that precisely match the evidence. So we're going to focus in on what we're reading. And then finally, we find the hidden meaning. We ask, what was my subject's big decision? What did my character choose not to do? And that's a key word. What did they choose not to do? And what can I learn from the choice that they made? All right, the lesson language. For those of us who've been together before, just remember we've talked about lesson language is just kind of the verbiage that you want to use when we're using this skill or introducing the lesson. So on the anchor chart, it may look something like this. Based on what we've read in whatever the title is, I think one possible thing that the author might think is important about the story is, and then I think the author feels, and here you would plug in some type of emotion or thought towards the person, event, or situation. So a full-on example might be, in Boycott Blues, the author tells the story of Rosa Parks and other civil rights leaders, based on all the details of the hardships that the leaders faced and how they kept persevering, as well as some of the final lines like, now you see the power of the won't stop shoes, or bye bye boycott blues. I think that one possible thing that the author might think is important about the story is that it was because of the ongoing efforts of a few people that many people today enjoy those greater freedoms. It's a mouthful, but it's going to help those kids think about the overall theme and idea behind what the author was writing about and the story of that person. And you also want to throw in, I think, your thoughts about what the author may have been feeling, because we're looking at that author's purpose on the slide, because remember, we're not introducing 6 or 7 skills at once, just as we're focusing in on reading this narrative fiction. I think the author feels gratitude toward those who came before her. Okay. You might want to break those lesson language pieces down and use them in your think alouds and discussions with the learners, but also consider creating little sentence stem cards with the lesson language on it for those think, pair, share partnerships. All right, thinking stems. This anchor chart would list those thinking stems that kind of guide our thinking as we're reading. What is important about the story? Why do you think the author told this story? Do you notice a theme at the end, like you would in a fictional story? And what seems to matter most to this person or story? And what did you take away from the story? Okay, so there we're making those connections. Consider posting the thinking stems so that you and your learners have easy access to them, just like with all your other thinking charts. All right, let's dive on in to our I will and by statements. So, another mouthful. We're looking at TEAC 4.7. I will identify similarities and differences between the events and characters' experiences in a fictional work and the actual events and experiences described in an author's biography or autobiography. And we're going to do that by sharing our thoughts with a think, pair, share partner about the person's struggle and big decision, and sharing what I can learn from the choices that they made. Okay, and the final component before we look at the model is an example of how we might employ the gradual release of responsibility. So let's take a look at those parts. On day 1, I do. Okay, use a narrative nonfiction book to introduce why does the story matter. To introduce this strategy, consider using a previously read or familiar mentor text from the writer's workshop or a read or think aloud that we've done in class already. And be sure to use those thinking stems. So as you can see, probably off to the side, there are several options to choose from. There are hundreds and hundreds out there. But during this unit, you're going to be reading some with your class as think alouds, as read alouds. Just consider when you're introducing this strategy to pull one of those that you've already introduced. Day 2, we do. Use a different narrative nonfiction book to review why does the story matter. Okay. Again, you'll have several to choose from because during this unit, you're reading those aloud with your kids. Make sure you use a different previously read text and also use those thinking stems. Now, on this after day 2, you'll notice that it says days ... And then it says consider holding here for a few lessons as needed. This means that you're going to kind of stick in this area until you feel like your kids are ready. Not all of the kids are going to be ready at the same time. Some will be able to move on into the they do stage. Others, you're going to have to hold them right here for a while to make sure they know what to do. This does not mean, though, like we say every 6 weeks, it does not mean that you're still teaching this lesson over and over again during your mini lesson time. But what it does mean is that you are touching back on that strategy as you move on. Okay? During your think alouds, during your talk time with the kiddos, you're reaching back and pulling those sentence stems and drawing them back into what it means to be able to connect with both genres. Then finally, on days 3, 4, 5, whenever it is you see that your kids are ready, it's time for the they do part. Students are going to work on the strategy in a literacy station independently or with partners. And they are going to use those familiar texts. It can even be very short stories that you've already read. But remember, it's best to not have them introducing something that they haven't read before to work on the strategy. And always, as usual, consider the needs of the individuals when you're selecting the text. Not every group is going to need the same text. All right, it is time to play around with this model lesson, okay? I always like to throw in a quote, and it doesn't always match what we're doing, but it's something for us to think about. This one just happens to go pretty well with the book that we're going to look at. If you can't see anything beautiful in yourself, get a better mirror. That's by Kendall Jenner. And those of you who have been with me for the different weeks, you kind of know that I'm a quote person. I like that. All right. So let's take a look at the model lesson. Oh, hold please. We want to refer back here because we're going to look at the different parts as we go through the lesson. We're going to start off with previewing the text. That means we're going to think about what do we already know about the person and what details should we focus on as it relates to them. So pretend like we've already read this story, Knocking on Wood, starring Peg Leg Bates. And we're going to do a little activation of schema. So of course, if you've already read the story, then you have some type of anchor chart that you and the kids have gone through. For me, it's a circle map. The first time we read about Mr. Clayton Bates, we learned what? And so these are things that we might have already said that we've learned. That Clayton got hurt in a bad accident. His leg was removed by a doctor. He loved to dance. He would sneak away and dance at the barber shop and his mom would catch him. Those are things that the kids may have already said. But we also want to talk about, after having some time for reflection, is there anything else that you'd like to add? I always like to ask my kids that because in the moment you may forget some things and then you've had time to think about it and then you come back to it. So they may want to add, his uncle made him a wooden leg so he could dance. We didn't have that thought here before, and it adds to our understanding and comprehension. All people were invited to his country club. That is super important to this story. And for those of you who haven't read it, we're going to walk through it really quickly so you'll understand why. But adding that thought would be very important. And we're still up here where we're previewing our text. All right, so what we talked about before from Knocking on Wood with Mr. Peg Leg Bates, the author is Lynn Barash, okay? The first time we read, we also, and notice I have lots of thinking tabs for myself because I have to be able to do that to walk back through the lesson with the kids. It's really hard to try to memorize everything, especially when you have 20 little faces or 25 little faces looking up at you. We also uncovered some word treasures that will help us build our vocabulary word bank. And so as we're previewing the text, we'll go back through and take a look at our vocabulary. So one of our words was sharecropper, okay? That means that a person is growing crops, they're working for someone else, they're working the land, they're growing the crops for that person, and the person who's growing the crops gets a little bit of the crops and a little bit of the money, but it mostly goes to the person who owns the land. So sharecropping was not a fair job. We also talked about amputated, okay? Remember, we talked about that means that parts of your body, maybe a finger, arm, or leg, just like for Mr. Clayton, is taken off by a doctor. It's surgically removed. That's what amputated means. And then we also talked about whittled, okay? That's a style of wood carving where you are creating an object by cutting away tiny little slivers of wood at a time. It's really cool. Now, before we walk through the story, we also talked about the language that we were going to find in this story. Now remember, and I'm talking to you like the kids, okay? This language was from a different time period. It was a time when not all people wanted to be friends. So we don't use this language anymore. When we talk to people or when we speak about them, it's not the language that we use. So when we read the story, well, when we read it, we were talking about that the language was different because they lived in a different time. We live in a time when people are mostly more accepting of one another's differences, and that's awesome. So we don't have to talk like this anymore, which is great. So let's walk back through Knocking on Wood, starring Pegleg Bates. What we remember is that Clayton Bates, he was a little kid and he loved to dance. Everywhere he went, he danced. His mama was a sharecropper, so we talked about that, how she had to work, and she got very little of the cotton that she sharecropped and very little of the money. So it was hard work and it kind of wasn't fair. But we know that Clayton did not like working outside in the field. So he would sneak off to the barber shop and he would dance there. And his mom got, and the kids would say, angry because she didn't like that. She wanted him to be safe at home with her. When he was 12, he asked her if he could go work in one of the mills down in town. And she said no for a while. And then he begged, and she finally said yes. But sad thing happened when he went to work there. He had only been there for just 3 days, and his leg was caught in a machine. And then the doctor had to surgically remove it, or what's our word? Amputate it. Okay. So of course his mom's sad. Clayton still wanted to dance, so after feeling really down for a while, he was like, no more of this. I'm gonna get up and try to walk. So he made some crutches from broomsticks. Remember that? And not only did he walk on his broomsticks, but he danced. Right. So his uncle saw that Clayton still wanted to dance and move around, so he whittled, there's our word, he whittled a special leg for him out of wood so that he could stand. Now, it took him a while to learn how to balance on that leg because, look, it doesn't have a foot. We talked about that. But he worked hard and he learned, and not only did he stand, not only did he walk, but he danced. That's right. Okay. So he practiced, and then he created his own style of dancing from what he already knew. So what we've talked about before is lots of things are already invented. Lots of things are already here, but when you add your special touch to them, you make it your own, just like he did. Okay? His signature step was called the American Jet Plane. He performed all over the world. He had a really good time, but sometimes he had to deal with some unfair treatment. Remember we were talking about that language? Unfair treatment just because of who he was. The good thing for us is that we no longer have to be treated unfairly for any reason, no matter what our ethnicity, our gender, no matter how much money we have, we all get to be treated fairly. So that's awesome. He didn't care though. He kept dancing. He just sucked it up and kept moving, dancing everywhere all over the world. He even ended up dancing for the Queen of England. So he got to travel far. Then when he finally, he danced all over the world, and he saw that sometimes people weren't treated so fairly, he said he was going to create a place for everybody to be treated fairly. So he opened his own resort called the Pegleg Bates Country Club in New York, and all people, no matter what, were welcomed. And he performed for them, and he welcomed people for more than 35 years. That's a lot of dancing. Okay? So let's take a quick listen to the end so we can refresh our memory. This is a quote from Mr. Bates. Black or white, one leg or two, it doesn't matter. Good is good. I was equal to or better than the best of the two-leg tappers. Nobody ever caught up with me, and there's been a lot that tried. Don't look at me in sympathy. I'm glad I'm this way. I feel good knocking on wood. As long as I can say I mix light fantastics up with hot gymnastics. I'm Pegleg Bates, one-leg dancing man. Okay? And we looked at the real picture of him and kind of talked through his story. Okay? So, we have read closely. We kind of reviewed because the first time we read closely and we were very careful. So now let's look back through one more time. What was my subject's big decision? Okay, he decided that he wasn't going to give up no matter what. He wanted to dance, and that's what he did. Remember how we made a connection? My cousin Courtney is a tap dancer, and so I know how much effort it takes to tap dance on 2 legs. I cannot imagine trying to learn how to tap dance with 1. So it was a lot of work. So that was a big, big decision. What did my character choose not to do? He chose not to what? Give up. Exactly. And then what can I learn from the choice that he made? Well, let's look at this very last sentence back here. In spite of the adversity he faced, Pegleg Bates never let anything stop him. And so then we would go through and talk about not letting anything stop us. Okay, and kind of filling in the blanks here based on what we've read in Knocking on Wood, the story of Mr. Clayton Bates. We think that the author might think it's important that we continue to follow our dreams and never give up no matter what happens. And I think that the author feels a little bit of awe or excitement when she writes about Mr. Pegleg Bates. Okay? So that's what day 1 would look like when we're doing our gradual release. In day 2, you would pull another familiar story and walk back through it with the vocabulary, the previewing, the activating the schema, and having the kids talk about things that they remember after reflection. All of those steps, but then maybe they would kind of move off and start doing it in think, pair, share partners, and then turn and talk back to you. And then remember, you would hold there at days 3, 4, 5, however many you need to hold for those different groups, and allow them to practice on their during your think alouds, and you're talking back to them and making sure that they understand the concept. Then finally, you would gradually release them to do it on their own with their partners in literacy stations, using thinking stems or breaking these down into little partner discussion cards, either way that you chose to do it. Okay, so that is our strategy for this 4-6 weeks. And again, you can find it in our the Reading Strategies book. And it is titled, Why Does the Story Matter? Thank you.